Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. A blink. That's all it took. One moment, the figure was a distant silhouette on the far ridge. The next, it stood mere yards away, its inhuman eyes boring into mine. As I scrambled backwards, my mind reeling, I realized with growing horror that whatever this thing was, it defied the laws of nature, and I was its prey. My name is Maya, and I've always considered myself an experienced hiker. Growing up in Colorado, I spent more weekends on mountain trails than I did in shopping malls. But nothing in my years of outdoor adventure could have prepared me for what I encountered on that fateful day in the San Juan Mountains. It was supposed to be a solo day hike, a chance to clear my head after a messy breakup and some trouble at work. I chose a challenging but familiar trail, one that wound its way up to a stunning viewpoint overlooking a vast alpine valley. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, clear blue skies, and the aspens putting on a dazzling show of gold and orange. I made good time on the ascent, my muscles falling into the familiar rhythm of the climb. As I neared the summit, a sense of accomplishment washed over me. This was why I loved hiking: the physical challenge, the solitude, the connection with nature. I felt more like myself than I had in months. Reaching the viewpoint, I paused to catch my breath and take in the panorama before me. The valley stretched out below, a patchwork of dark evergreens and brilliant fall colors. In the distance, snow-capped peaks pierced the sky. I pulled out my water bottle and snapped a few photos with my phone, reveling in the moment. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a dark spot on the opposite ridge, maybe half a mile away. I squinted, trying to make out details. Was it a fellow hiker? A large animal? Something about its shape seemed off. I pulled out my small binoculars for a better look. Through the lenses, I could see that the figure was roughly humanoid, but too tall and thin to be a person. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its skin seemed to shift and ripple, as if it couldn't quite decide on a solid form. A chill ran down my spine. What was I looking at? Some kind of optical illusion, a trick of the light? I lowered the binoculars, intending to rub my eyes and look again. But in that split second, that single blink, everything changed. The figure was no longer on the distant ridge. It stood not 20 feet away from me, its form even more unsettling up close. Its body was a mass of shifting shadows, vaguely human-shaped but constantly in motion. Where its face should have been, there were only two glowing points of light, like stars plucked from the night sky. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist outside of nightmares and horror movies. The being took a step forward, moving with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Its eyes never left mine, and I felt a pressure building in my head, like something was trying to push its way into my thoughts. What? What are you? I managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature tilted its head, an eerily human gesture. When it spoke, its voice seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly in my mind. "We are the Watchers," it said, the words carrying a weight of age and otherness that made me dizzy. "We have walked these mountains since before your kind learned to stand upright. And you, little one, have strayed into our domain." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen in terror. But my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the creature's gaze had turned me to stone. "Please," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "I didn't mean to trespass. I'll leave right away." The being made a sound that might have been laughter, but it held no warmth or humor. "Leave? Oh no, little one. You cannot unsee what has been seen. You cannot unknow what you now know. It reached out one impossibly long arm, shadowy fingers stretching towards my face. I flinched, expecting a cold or slimy touch. Instead, where its hand made contact with my skin, I felt a jolt of electricity. Images flooded my mind, vast, incomprehensible vistas of time and space, creatures that defied description, civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the onslaught of information. Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to process even a fraction of what I was seeing. "Enough," I gasped. "Please, it's too much." The vision stopped abruptly, leaving me panting and disoriented. When I looked up, the being had retreated a few steps, regarding me with what almost seemed like curiosity. "You are stronger than most," it said. "Perhaps there is more to your kind than we thought." I struggled to my feet, my legs shaky. What happens now?" I asked, dreading the answer. The creature was silent for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, it began to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial. "Now, you return to your world," it said, its voice growing fainter. "But know this, you carry a piece of our reality with you now. The veil between worlds has been lifted, and you will see things that others cannot. Use this gift wisely, for knowledge is both a blessing and a curse." With that, it vanished completely, leaving me alone on the mountaintop. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been some kind of altitude-induced hallucination, but the images I had seen, the knowledge that had been imparted, it was all still there, seared into my memory. The hike back down the mountain was a blur. I moved on autopilot, my mind still reeling from the encounter. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that seemed almost painfully vivid. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to resume my normal life. But things were different. I would catch glimpses of impossible things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving against the wind, creatures that vanished when I turned to look at them directly. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I would feel that pressure in my head again, as if the being was trying to communicate with me across vast distances. I never told anyone about what happened on that mountain. Who would believe me? But I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that my encounter with the Watcher had changed me irrevocably. I had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of reality, and there was no going back. Now, years later, I still hike those mountains, but I do so with a newfound respect and caution. I know that there are things out there, ancient and powerful beings that exist just beyond the edge of our perception. And sometimes, if the conditions are just right, they allow themselves to be seen. So if you're ever hiking in the high country and you spot a strange figure on a distant ridge, think twice before you look too closely. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some boundaries better left uncrossed. Because once you've seen beyond the veil, you can never truly unsee it, and the knowledge you gain may come at a price higher than you're willing to pay. As for me, I'll keep exploring the mountains, carrying the weight of what I've learned, and I'll wonder, with each step, what other secrets these ancient peaks might be hiding, and what might happen the next time I blink at the wrong moment. The sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling grew louder, closing in from all sides. My heart raced as I realized the awful truth. I wasn't being chased by one creature, but by many. And in the pitch-black forest, with only the feeble beam of my dying flashlight to guide me, I knew my chances of escape were dwindling by the second. It was supposed to be a simple shortcut. I'd done it 100 times before, cutting through the woods behind my house to get home after my late shift at the diner. Sure, it was a little creepy at night, but it saved me a good 20 minutes of walking along the winding country roads. Plus, I knew these woods like the back of my hand, Or so I thought. My name's Sarah, and I've lived in this small, rural town my whole life. The forest has always been a part of my world, a place of adventure during the day and quiet mystery at night. But never, in all my years, had I experienced anything like this. It started normally enough. I left work around 11 p.m., waving goodbye to my coworkers as I set off down the familiar path that led into the woods. The night was cool and clear, a full moon peeking through the canopy of leaves overhead. I hummed to myself as I walked, my flashlight bobbing in front of me, illuminating the well-worn trail. About halfway through my usual route, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed quieter than usual. Normally, even at night, you could hear the chirp of crickets, the hoot of owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But tonight, there was nothing. Just an eerie, oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I picked up my pace, suddenly eager to be out of the woods and back in the safety of my home. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping loudly somewhere off to my left. I froze, my flashlight beam darting to the source of the sound. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Something big. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent forest. "Is someone there?" No response. Just another snap. Closer this time, followed by a low, rumbling growl that was definitely not from any animal I knew. That's when I ran. All thoughts of the path forgotten, I crashed through the underbrush. My only goal to put as much distance between myself and whatever was behind me as possible. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me at every step, but terror drove me on. As I ran, I became aware of more sounds of pursuit, not just from behind me, but from the sides as well. Whatever was chasing me, there was more than one, and they were fast, much faster than me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear them getting closer, their heavy breathing and the sound of their passage through the woods growing louder with each passing second. Just as I thought I couldn't go on any longer, my flashlight flickered and died. I was plunged into near total darkness, the faint moonlight barely penetrating the dense canopy above. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I stumbled forward, now blind and lost in a forest that had suddenly become terrifyingly unfamiliar. That's when I tripped. My foot caught on a root or a rock, I couldn't tell which, and I went down hard. The breath knocked out of me as I hit the forest floor. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and gasping for air. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, and I knew with a sickening certainty that this was it. Whatever was chasing me was about to catch up. As I struggled to my feet, my hand brushed against something smooth and cold. Stone. I felt around and realized I was at the base of a large boulder. Without thinking, I began to climb, using what little strength I had left to haul myself up its rough surface. I reached the top just as the first of my pursuers burst into the small clearing below. In the faint moonlight, I could finally see what had been chasing me, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. They were wrong. That's the only way I can describe them. Vaguely humanoid in shape, but too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their skin was a mottled gray, and where their faces should have been, there were only smooth, featureless expanses of flesh. They moved with an unnatural grace, circling the boulder where I crouched. I could feel their attention on me, even though they had no eyes that I could see. One of them reached out a long, spindly arm, its fingers nearly brushing my foot. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the far side of the boulder's top. Just as I thought all hope was lost, I heard a new sound. A horn, deep and resonant, echoing through the forest. The creatures below me froze, their heads turning in unison towards the source of the sound. The horn sounded again, closer this time, and with it came the sound of hoofbeats, growing louder by the second. The creatures began to retreat, melting back into the shadows of the forest with inhuman speed. Moments later, a group of riders burst into the clearing. They were dressed strangely, in what looked like ancient armor, carrying spears and swords that glinted in the moonlight. At their head rode a figure that seemed to glow with an inner light, a crown of antlers adorning their head. The lead rider dismounted and approached the boulder. As they drew closer, I saw that it was a woman, her face both beautiful and terrifying in its otherworldly perfection. "Child," she said, her voice like music and thunder combined, "you have strayed into a realm not meant for mortal feet. Come, we must return you to your world before the wild hunt claims you for their own." Too shocked and exhausted to argue, I let her help me down from the boulder. She lifted me onto her horse as if I weighed nothing, and we set off through the forest at a pace that seemed impossible given the dense undergrowth. As we rode, the forest around us seemed to blur and shift. Trees that had been familiar all my life took on strange, twisted shapes. I caught glimpses of impossible things in the shadows, eyes gleaming from hollow trees, flowers that glowed and pulsed like living things, creatures that defied description flitting just at the edge of my vision. Finally, we emerged from the tree line, and I found myself staring at the back of my own house. It felt like we'd been riding for hours, but the position of the moon suggested that barely any time had passed at all. The woman helped me down from her horse. "Remember," she said, her eyes boring into mine, "the veil between worlds grows thin on nights like these. Stay to the paths you know, and do not venture into the deep woods after dark. For there are things that dwell in the shadows that hunger for mortal souls." Before I could respond, she and her strange company were gone, melting back into the forest as if they'd never been there at all. I stumbled into my house, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. The woods I'd known all my life were not what they seemed. There was another world hidden just beyond the veil of our reality, a world of ancient magics and terrifying creatures. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, that veil grows thin enough for unwary travelers to slip through. I still live in this town, still work at the diner, but I never take that shortcut through the woods anymore, no matter how late my shift runs. And on full moon nights, when the air is heavy with possibility, I make sure my doors are locked and my curtains drawn. Because now I know the truth. The monsters in the shadows are real, and sometimes they come hunting in our world. The dying embers of my campfire cast a feeble glow, barely illuminating the dense forest around me. I was drifting off to sleep when a twig snapped nearby, jolting me awake. My blood ran cold as I saw him, a stranger, silently watching me from the edge of the clearing. In that moment, I realized that in the vast wilderness, I was no longer alone. I've always been a solitary camper. There's something about the solitude of the forest that speaks to my soul. The quiet rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the gentle babbling of a nearby stream. These sounds are more comforting to me than any city noise could ever be. That's why I often find myself in remote corners of national forests, far from designated campgrounds and other humans. This particular trip was no different. I had hiked deep into the Chattahoochee National Forest, setting up camp in a small clearing I'd discovered on a previous expedition. The day had been perfect, warm sunshine filtering through the canopy, a cool breeze keeping the bugs at bay. I'd spent hours exploring the surrounding area, cataloging plant species and watching for wildlife. As night fell, I made a small fire, cooked my dinner, and settled in with a good book. It must have been close to midnight when I finally put the book down and crawled into my tent. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting just enough light to see the immediate area around my campsite. I was almost asleep when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping under someone's foot. My eyes flew open, suddenly wide awake. I held my breath, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual nighttime forest sounds. Then I heard it again, the soft crunch of leaves, like someone trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw him. A man was standing at the edge of my campsite, just beyond the fading circle of firelight. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that seemed to blend into the forest behind him, but it was his stillness that unnerved me the most. He stood perfectly motionless, like a statue, staring directly at my tent. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he must be able to hear it. Who was he? What was he doing out here, miles from any trail? And why was he just watching me? I weighed my options. I could call out to him, ask if he needed help, but something in my gut warned me against revealing that I was awake. I could try to sneak away, but in the dark forest, he'd have the advantage. My best bet, I decided, was to stay put and hope he'd move on. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. The stranger remained motionless, his gaze never wavering from my tent. I was starting to wonder if I was hallucinating, if the isolation had finally gotten to me, when he suddenly moved. It wasn't the normal movement of a person shifting their weight or stretching. One moment he was standing still. The next he was crouched by my dying fire, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the embers. In that brief moment of illumination, I saw his face clearly. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight like a cat's. His mouth was set in a thin, humorless line. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me. They were completely, utterly devoid of emotion. Not angry, not curious, just empty. As quickly as he had moved to the fire, he was back at the edge of the clearing. I blinked. Sure, I must have dozed off and dreamed the whole thing. But no, he was still there, watching, waiting. For what? I didn't know. And I didn't want to find out. Moving as quietly as I could, I reached for my phone. No signal, of course. I was miles from the nearest cell tower. My hand brushed against something else in my pack, the small canister of bear spray I always carried. I grabbed it, feeling slightly more secure with a weapon in hand. That's when I heard his voice. "I know you're awake," he said, his tone conversational, as if we were chatting over coffee instead of in the middle of a dark forest. "Why don't you come out so we can talk properly?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. How long had he known I was watching him? "No need to be afraid," he continued when I didn't respond. "I'm just a fellow traveler, looking for some company." Something in his voice sent chills down my spine. It was too smooth, too practiced, like he'd said these words many times before. "I'm fine in here, thanks," I managed to croak out, my voice shaky. "Maybe you should move on to the next campsite." He chuckled, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "Oh, but there is no next campsite, not for miles and miles. It's just you and me out here." The way he said it made it clear that he knew exactly how isolated we were. I tightened my grip on the bear spray, my mind racing. Could I make a run for it? Did I remember the way back to the trail in the dark? Before I could decide, he moved again. One moment he was at the edge of the clearing. The next he was right outside my tent. I could see his shadow looming over me, hear his breathing. "Last chance," he said, his voice now a low growl. "Come out, or I'm coming in." In that moment, terror gave way to something else, a primal, desperate need to survive. Without thinking, I unzipped the tent and sprayed the bear mace directly at where I thought his face would be. He screamed, an inhuman sound of pain and rage. I didn't wait to see the effects. I burst out of the tent, shouldering past him, and ran blindly into the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear him behind me, his movements unnaturally fast and quiet for someone who'd just been maced. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. But the sounds of pursuit never faded. Just as I thought I couldn't go on, I saw a glimmer of light ahead. A road. A house. I didn't care. Anything was better than this nightmarish chase through the dark woods. I burst out of the tree line and found myself on a small country road. A car was approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I waved my arms frantically, relief flooding through me as the car slowed to a stop. An older couple peered out at me, their faces a mixture of concern and wariness. "Are you all right, son?" the man asked. I turned to look back at the woods, expecting to see my pursuer emerging from the trees. But there was nothing there. Just the dark, silent forest. I think so," I stammered. "Can you give me a ride to the nearest town? Please." They agreed, though I could tell they were hesitant to let a wild-eyed, disheveled stranger into their car. As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see the gaunt-faced man standing in the middle of the road, watching us drive away. But there was nothing, just empty road and dark forest. I never went back for my gear, never reported what happened to the rangers or the police. Who would believe me? A mysterious man appearing and disappearing in the woods, moving with impossible speed. I'd sound crazy. It's been years since that night, but I still have nightmares about it. In my dreams, I'm back in that tent, listening to the stranger's footsteps circling me. Sometimes I wake up sure that I can hear his voice, calling me to come out and talk. I don't go camping alone anymore. In fact, I rarely go into the woods at all, because now I know the truth that most people never have to face. When you're alone in the wilderness, you're never really alone. There are things out there, watching and waiting, and sometimes they get hungry for company. The symbols carved into the ancient stones pulsed with an eerie blue light, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I stood there, transfixed by their otherworldly glow, I realized with growing horror that I had stumbled upon something far beyond my understanding, something that was never meant to be discovered by mortal eyes. My name is Liam, and I'm an archaeology student specializing in pre-Columbian Native American cultures. When I first heard rumors of strange stone carvings deep in the Ozark Mountains, I was skeptical but intrigued. Local legends spoke of a hidden valley where the old magic still lingered, protected by spirits that didn't take kindly to intruders. Of course, I didn't believe in magic or spirits. I was a man of science, after all. But the possibility of uncovering a previously unknown Native American site was too tempting to resist. So, armed with topographical maps, a backpack full of supplies, and more enthusiasm than common sense, I set out into the wilderness. The first 2 days of my expedition were uneventful. I hiked through dense forests and climbed steep ridges, following the vague directions I'd gleaned from old trail guides and local folklore. By the third day, I was beginning to think the whole trip had been a waste of time. Then, as the sun was setting on the third evening, I saw it, a narrow gap between two towering cliffs, barely visible through the thick underbrush. It matched the description I'd been given of the entrance to the Spirit Valley. My heart raced with excitement as I pushed through the foliage and squeezed through the rocky passage. The valley beyond took my breath away. It was like stepping into another world. Mist clung to the ground, swirling around ancient trees that seemed to whisper with every breeze. In the center of the valley stood a circle of standing stones, each easily 20 feet tall and covered in intricate carvings. As an archaeologist, I should have been ecstatic. This was the find of a lifetime, something that could rewrite our understanding of pre-Columbian cultures in North America. But as I approached the stone circle, a sense of unease settled over me. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I set up camp just outside the circle, planning to start documenting the site at first light. As night fell, the forest around me grew unnaturally quiet. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. It was as if the entire valley was holding its breath. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I unzipped my tent and peered out, my blood running cold at what I saw. The carvings on the stones were glowing, pulsing with a soft blue light that cast eerie shadows across the misty ground. And there, moving between the stones, were figures. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs that moved with an inhuman grace. Their faces, when I caught glimpses of them, were an unsettling blend of human and animal features. I watched, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and fascination, as these beings performed what could only be described as a ritual. They danced and chanted, their voices rising and falling in a language I'd never heard before. The glowing symbols on the stones seemed to respond to their movements, flaring brighter at certain points in the ceremony. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped and turned, looking directly at me. Its eyes glowed with the same blue light as the stones, and I felt a presence push against my mind, alien and ancient. "Watcher," a voice echoed in my head. "You do not belong here." I tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words came out. The being tilted its head, regarding me with what felt like curiosity. "You seek knowledge," it continued, "but some truths are not meant for your kind. Leave this place while you still can." The pressure in my head increased, and I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the alien presence in my mind. Images flashed before my eyes, civilizations rising and falling, creatures that defied description, vast expanses of space and time that my human brain could barely comprehend. When I came to, the sun was rising. The stone circle stood silent and still, no trace of the glowing symbols or the strange beings. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a vivid dream. But as I packed up my camp with shaking hands, I knew deep in my bones that what I'd witnessed was real. I practically ran out of the valley, not stopping until I was back in familiar territory. As I hiked back to civilization, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to tell the world, to share this incredible discovery. But a larger part, the part that still echoed with the alien presence I'd encountered, knew that some secrets were better left buried. In the years since that night, I've struggled with what I experienced. I abandoned my archaeology studies, unable to reconcile my scientific training with what I now knew to be true. I've pored over ancient texts and obscure folklore, searching for any mention of the beings I encountered or the power contained in those stones. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can hear that chanting again, calling me back to the hidden valley. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see those glowing eyes and hear that otherworldly voice. Some truths are not meant for your kind. I've never gone back to that valley, and I've never told anyone the full story of what I saw. Who would believe me? But I know it's out there, hidden away in the depths of the wilderness, a place where the veil between worlds is thin, where ancient magic still holds sway, and where beings beyond our comprehension still walk. So if you're ever hiking in the remote wilderness and you come across a hidden valley with standing stones, think twice before you enter. Some discoveries come with a price, and some knowledge, once gained, can never be unlearned. As for me, I'll keep searching for answers, knowing I may never fully understand what I experienced that night. But one thing I know for certain, the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine. And sometimes the unknown is better left unexplored. The echo of my friend's voice bounced off the canyon walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help me!" it cried. But as I spun around trying to pinpoint its source, a chilling realization crept over me. Whatever was calling out wasn't Tom, and I was no longer alone in these woods. I've always been an avid hiker, but this trip was different. My best friend Tom and I had decided to tackle a challenging backcountry trail in the Adirondacks, pushing ourselves further into the wilderness than we'd ever gone before. We were both experienced outdoorsmen, or so we thought, and the idea of spending a week off the grid was exhilarating. The first few days were everything we'd hoped for. Grueling hikes rewarded with breathtaking vistas, peaceful nights under star-filled skies, and the deep satisfaction that comes from self-reliance in the wild. We fell into an easy rhythm, Tom taking the lead with his superior navigation skills while I handled most of the camp setup and cooking. It was on the fourth day that things started to go wrong. We'd planned to reach a particular campsite by nightfall, but a series of small setbacks, a missed turn, a harder-than-expected climb, a brief afternoon thunderstorm, had put us behind schedule. As the sun began to set, we realized we were still a good 2 hours from our intended destination. "We should find a spot to camp soon," I said, eyeing the darkening sky warily. "I don't like the idea of hiking these trails in the dark." Tom nodded, squinting at his map. "There's a clearing about half a mile ahead. It's not ideal, but it'll do for the night." We pressed on, our headlamps cutting thin beams through the growing gloom. The forest seemed to close in around us, the familiar daytime sounds giving way to the more ominous noises of night. An owl hooted somewhere nearby, making me jump. "Scared of the dark, Alex?" Tom teased, glancing back at me with a grin. I was about to retort when he suddenly stumbled, crying out in pain. "Shit," he hissed, dropping to one knee. "You okay?" I asked, hurrying to his side. He grimaced, rubbing his ankle. "Stepped wrong on a root. I think it's just twisted, but it hurts like hell." I helped him to his feet, letting him lean on me as we hobbled the rest of the way to the clearing. It was smaller than we'd hoped, barely big enough for our 2-person tent, but it would have to do. As I set up camp, Tom sat with his back against a tree, gingerly examining his ankle. "It's swelling up pretty bad," he said, his voice tight with pain. "I don't think I'll be able to hike on this tomorrow." I felt a knot of anxiety form in my stomach. We were at least 2 days' hike from the nearest road, with no cell service. If Tom couldn't walk, "Let's just get some rest," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Maybe it'll be better in the morning." But morning brought no improvement. If anything, Tom's ankle looked worse, swollen and discolored. He could barely put any weight on it. "You need to go for help," he said after we'd exhausted all other options. "There's a ranger station about 15 miles northeast of here. If you push hard, you could make it by nightfall." I didn't like the idea of leaving him alone, but we both knew it was the only choice. I packed a day bag with essentials, leaving Tom with most of our supplies and our satellite emergency beacon, a last resort if things got worse. "I'll be back with help as soon as I can," I promised, giving his shoulder a squeeze before setting off. The day passed in a blur of hard hiking, my mind focused solely on covering ground as quickly as possible. But as afternoon faded into evening, I realized with growing dread that I'd miscalculated. The ranger station was further than we'd thought, and the terrain was more difficult than I'd anticipated. As darkness fell, I knew I had to make a choice. Push on through the night, risking injury on the treacherous trails, or make camp and continue at first light. Reluctantly, I chose the latter, finding a small space just off the trail to hunker down. That's when I heard it, Tom's voice, calling out from the darkness. "Alex, help me!" I shot to my feet, heart pounding. Had he followed me? Had his ankle miraculously healed? "Tom," I called back. "Where are you?" "Over here," his voice replied, seeming to come from my left. But when I turned in that direction, training my headlamp on the trees, there was nothing there. "Tom," I shouted again, panic rising in my throat. This time, his voice came from behind me. "Help me, Alex, I'm hurt." I spun around, but again, there was no sign of him, just endless dark trees. That's when the cold realization set in. This couldn't be Tom. Whatever was out there, whatever was calling to me with my friend's voice, it wasn't human. A twig snapped nearby, and I whirled towards the sound. For a split second, my headlamp illuminated something, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. But it was gone before I could fully process what I'd seen, melting into the shadows between one blink and the next. Alex, Tom's voice called again, this time a whisper right next to my ear. Why did you leave me? I ran. All thoughts of direction or safety vanished, replaced by blind animal panic. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. But no matter how fast I moved, I could hear it behind me, not running, but gliding, effortlessly keeping pace. I don't know how long I fled. Time lost all meaning in the terror and the darkness. But eventually, my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, tumbling down a steep embankment. I came to rest at the bottom, dazed and aching, certain that at any moment I would feel cold, inhuman hands grabbing me. But nothing came. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized I could no longer hear my pursuer. The forest was silent save for my own ragged breathing. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. My headlamp had been lost in the fall, but the first faint light of dawn was starting to filter through the trees. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that I had landed next to a small stream. Relief washed over me. I knew from our maps that if I followed this stream downstream, it would eventually lead me to a larger river, and from there to civilization. I had a direction, a purpose beyond blind flight. As I began to pick my way along the stream bank, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a stress-induced hallucination? Some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and worry for my friend? But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever I had encountered in those dark woods was real, and ancient, and hungry. It had nearly lured me to my doom, using my own fears and friendship against me. It took me 2 more days of hard travel to reach the ranger station. When I finally stumbled into the clearing, dehydrated and half-starved, the rangers immediately launched a search and rescue operation for Tom. They found him right where I'd left him, his ankle badly infected but otherwise okay. The satellite beacon had malfunctioned, leaving him unable to call for help. When I told him about hearing his voice in the woods, he went pale. "I heard you too," he said quietly, calling out to me from the trees. "I almost crawled out there looking for you, but something told me to stay put." We never spoke about that night again. How could we explain it to others when we barely understood it ourselves? But to this day, I'm careful about hiking after dark. And if I ever hear a familiar voice calling out to me from the shadows of the forest, I know better than to answer. Because sometimes, the most dangerous things in the wilderness are the ones that know our deepest fears and closest bonds, and they're always hungry for new prey. The trees all looked the same. Every direction I turned, it was an endless sea of green and brown, mocking me with their uniformity. I'd been hiking these woods for 30 years, but now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized with growing dread that I was hopelessly, inexplicably lost. My name's Jack, and I've always prided myself on my outdoor skills. I grew up in these mountains, spending more time on trails than I did in classrooms. By the time I was a teenager, I could navigate the backcountry blindfolded, or so I thought. This particular hike was supposed to be routine, a day trip to my favorite fishing spot, a secluded lake nestled high in the mountains. I'd made this trek countless times before, in all seasons and weather conditions. It was a challenging route, off the main trails and requiring some bushwhacking, but nothing I couldn't handle. The day started perfectly. Clear skies, a cool breeze, and the promise of fat trout waiting at the end of the trail. I made good time on the ascent, my legs easily finding the familiar rhythm of the climb. By midday, I was at the lake, casting my line into the crystal clear water. It wasn't until I started to pack up for the return journey that things began to feel off. The air seemed to thicken, taking on an oppressive quality that had nothing to do with the weather. As I shouldered my pack and turned to head back down the mountain, a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, The trail looked the same as it always had, winding its way through dense forest and over rocky outcroppings. But as I walked, a nagging sense of unease grew in the pit of my stomach. The landmarks I expected to see weren't where they should be. Familiar rock formations seemed to have shifted. Trees I'd used as waypoints were missing or in the wrong places. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue or maybe a lapse in memory. But as the afternoon wore on and I failed to reach checkpoints I knew should be there, panic began to set in. I was lost. Me, the guy who could navigate these mountains in his sleep, was completely and utterly turned around. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar anymore. Every clearing, every stand of trees, every babbling brook looked identical. It was as if the forest itself had rearranged while I wasn't looking, creating an endless maze with no exit. As the light began to fade, I made the decision to set up camp for the night. It went against everything I'd ever learned about wilderness survival. If you're lost, you keep moving. You find high ground. You look for water sources that might lead to civilization. But some instinct, some primal part of my brain, screamed at me to stop, to hunker down and wait for morning. I found a small clearing and quickly set up my tent. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified, sinister. More than once, I whirled around, certain I'd catch a glimpse of whatever was stalking me. But there was never anything there. Just more trees, more sameness, stretching out in every direction. That night was the longest of my life. I lay awake in my tent, straining my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. The normal nighttime forest sounds, the hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, were conspicuously absent. The woods were eerily silent, as if holding their breath. Just before dawn, I heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, rising and falling like waves on a shore. I wanted to peek out of my tent, to try and locate the source of the sound, but fear kept me paralyzed in my sleeping bag. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, the chanting faded away. I emerged from my tent, half expecting to find myself surrounded by something, but there was nothing, just more trees, more green, more sameness. I packed up quickly, determined to find my way out. I picked a direction at random and started walking, figuring that if I kept going straight, I'd eventually hit a trail or a road or something that would lead me back to civilization. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky, then began its descent. And still, I walked. My water ran out. My legs burned with exertion, but the forest remained unchanged, an endless green labyrinth that seemed to shift and rearrange itself when I wasn't looking. As night began to fall again, despair set in. I was no closer to finding my way out than I had been the day before. In fact, I was convinced that despite walking all day, I had somehow ended up exactly where I started. That's when I saw it, a flicker of light through the trees. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a campfire, or a ranger station, or even just another lost hiker. Anything would be better than this solitude. I moved towards the light, pushing through thick underbrush. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a fire or a flashlight. It was softer, more diffuse, like moonlight, except the moon wasn't out yet. I burst through a line of trees into a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of standing stones, each about 7 feet tall. They looked ancient, covered in moss and strange, swirling symbols I didn't recognize. And they were glowing, emitting a soft, pulsing light that illuminated the clearing. As I stood there, transfixed, the chanting I'd heard the night before started up again. It seemed to be coming from the stones themselves, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. That's when I noticed the figures. Shadowy forms, barely visible in the strange light, moving between the stones. They weren't quite human, too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles. As I watched, frozen in terror, one of them turned towards me. I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth before I turned and ran. I crashed through the forest, blind with panic. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. The chanting followed me, growing louder and more frenzied. I could hear movement in the woods around me, swift and purposeful, closing in from all sides. Just as I thought my legs would give out, I burst out of the tree line and onto a paved road. A car was approaching, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. I waved my arms frantically, relief flooding through me as the car slowed to a stop. The driver, an older man with a kindly face, rolled down his window. "You all right, son?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. I turned to look back at the forest, expecting to see my pursuers emerging from the trees. But there was nothing there. No glowing stones, no shadowy figures, just the dark, silent woods. I think I'm lost," I managed to stammer out. The man smiled sympathetically. "Hop in. I'll give you a ride to town." As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us from the tree line. But there was nothing, just empty road and dark forest. It wasn't until we reached the town that I realized how far off course I'd gotten. I was over 50 miles from where I should have been, on the completely opposite side of the mountain range. It should have been impossible for me to have hiked that far in just 2 days. I never told anyone the full story of what happened in those woods. Who would believe me? But I've never gone back to those mountains. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can hear that chanting again, calling me back. And I wonder, with a chill down my spine, what would have happened if I'd stepped into that stone circle. So if you're ever hiking in the deep woods and you find yourself suddenly, inexplicably lost, be careful. Because sometimes the forest has plans of its own, and not everyone who wanders off the trail finds their way back. The laughter echoed up from the depths of the well, a child's giggle that sent ice through my veins. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, as the realization hit me. I was miles from civilization, and whatever was down there was definitely not human. I've always been drawn to abandoned places. There's something about the quiet decay, the whispers of lives once lived, that speaks to my soul. As a freelance photographer specializing in urban exploration, I've crawled through countless forgotten buildings and overgrown ruins, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of northern Maine. It started with a tip from a local at a small-town diner. I was passing through on my way to photograph an abandoned logging camp when the old man at the counter struck up a conversation. "You like old places, huh?" he said, eyeing my camera gear. "Ever heard of the Lost Village?" I admitted I hadn't. My interest piqued. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Folks around here don't like to talk about it. Whole town just up and vanished back in the 30s. Left everything behind. Houses, church, even the graveyard. Some say it was a disease. Others blame it on something unnatural." He gave me rough directions, warning me that the site was deep in the woods and hard to find. "Be careful out there," he added as I left. "Some places are best left forgotten." I should have heeded his warning. But the lure of a completely untouched ghost town was too strong to resist. The next morning, I set out into the forest, armed with my camera, a backpack full of supplies, and more excitement than common sense. The hike was grueling. The old logging roads had long since been reclaimed by nature, leaving me to bushwhack through dense underbrush. By late afternoon, I was beginning to think I'd made a mistake. Just as I was about to give up and turn back, I broke through a thicket and found myself on the outskirts of what was unmistakably a town. Time seemed to have stopped here. Weather-beaten houses stood silent, their windows dark and empty. Rusted cars from the 1920s and 30s sat in driveways, slowly being consumed by vegetation. At the center of town stood a small white church, its steeple listing slightly to one side. I spent hours photographing everything, marveling at how perfectly preserved it all was. There were no signs of looting or vandalism. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished in the middle of a normal day. As the sun began to set, I knew I should head back. But the fading light cast such a haunting glow over the abandoned buildings that I couldn't resist staying just a bit longer. I made my way to what looked like the town square, thinking it would make a perfect final shot. That's when I saw the well. It sat in the center of the square, a simple stone structure with a wooden roof. Something about it drew me in. As I approached, I noticed strange symbols carved into the stones. Nothing I recognized, but clearly intentional. I peered over the edge, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam didn't reach the bottom, but I could hear the faint trickle of water far below. Thinking it would make an interesting shot, I set up my tripod and leaned in with my camera. That's when I heard it. A giggle, faint but unmistakable, echoing up from the depths. I froze, certain I must have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a child's voice. "Come play with us," it said, its tone playful but with an undercurrent that made my skin crawl. "We've been so lonely." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, my mind playing tricks on me in this eerie setting. But then a small, pale hand emerged from the well, gripping the edge. It was followed by another, and slowly, a figure began to pull itself up. In the fading twilight, I could see that it had the shape of a child, but something was terribly wrong. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, its skin a sickly gray color. As its head cleared the edge of the well, it turned to face me. Where eyes should have been, there were only empty sockets, glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. Its mouth split into a grin that was far too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Won't you join us?" it asked, its voice now a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We have such games to play." I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the abandoned town, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I could hear movement all around me, whispers from open doorways, giggles from shadowed alleys, the scrape of something dragging itself across old wooden porches. The forest that had seemed so difficult to navigate earlier now felt like my only salvation. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear them behind me. Not pursuing, exactly, but calling, beckoning. "Come back." Their voices echoed through the trees. "Don't you want to know our secrets? Don't you want to know why we're still here?" I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst out of the tree line and onto a dirt road. A pair of headlights approached, and I waved my arms frantically, praying it wasn't just another trick of whatever darkness lurked in those woods. The truck screeched to a halt, and an old man leaned out the window, his face a mixture of concern and fear. "You okay, son?" he called out. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I turned to look back at the forest, half expecting to see pale, grinning faces watching from between the trees, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent woods. I think I'm lost," I managed to stammer. "Can you give me a ride to town?" The old man nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. As we drove away, I kept looking back, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us go. It wasn't until we reached the town that I realized how far I'd run. I was miles from where I'd parked my car, in a completely different part of the forest. The old man dropped me off at a small motel, refusing any payment and giving me a long, searching look before he drove away. That night, as I lay in the lumpy motel bed, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it had been real. In the days that followed, I heard whispers around town. Other hikers had gone missing in those woods over the years, only to return days later with no memory of where they'd been. Some came back changed, their eyes holding a haunted look that never quite faded. I left as soon as I could, abandoning my car and most of my equipment. Some things weren't worth going back for. I never wrote about what I saw, never shared the photos I'd taken before my encounter at the well. Some truths are too dangerous to spread. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that day. Sometimes, in my dreams, I hear those childish giggles again. I see those glowing, empty eyes and feel that presence calling to me, trying to draw me back. I never went back to those woods, never did another urban exploration shoot, because now I know the truth. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Some ruins are best left unexplored. And sometimes, the ghosts of the past are all too real and all too hungry for new company. So if you're ever hiking in the deep forests of Maine and you come across an old well in a clearing, don't look too closely, don't listen too hard, and whatever you do, don't answer if something calls your name from the depths. Because once you've glimpsed what lurks in the shadows of forgotten places, you can never truly escape it. The invitation will always be there, waiting for a moment of weakness. And trust me, you don't want to know what games they have to play. The scream that erupted from the figure on the trail wasn't human. As it charged towards us, my friend Sarah's hand found mine. And in that moment, I knew our late-night hike had become a fight for survival. It was supposed to be an adventure, a way to break up the monotony of our summer break. Sarah and I had been best friends since middle school, bonded by our love of the outdoors and our tendency to seek out the unusual. When we heard about the local legend of the Midnight Wanderer, a spectral figure said to haunt the Black Ridge Trail after dark, we couldn't resist the challenge. "Come on, Alex," Sarah had said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It'll be fun. We'll prove once and for all that it's just a stupid story." I should have known better. Growing up in a small town nestled against the Appalachian Mountains, I'd heard plenty of tales about things that lurked in the woods. But at 18, flushed with the invincibility of youth, those warnings seemed like relics of a more superstitious time. So there we were, creeping along the Black Ridge Trail well past midnight, our way lit only by the pale glow of the full moon and the bobbing beams of our flashlights. The forest was alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the leaves. "This is kind of creepy," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah grinned, though I could see a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "Don't tell me you're scared, Alex. It's just a forest." But it didn't feel like just a forest. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense of watchfulness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. We'd been hiking for about an hour when we reached the old stone bridge that marked the halfway point of the trail. Legend had it that this was where the Midnight Wanderer was most often seen, a tall, unnaturally still figure standing in the middle of the bridge. Sarah and I paused at the edge of the clearing, our flashlights playing over the weathered stones of the bridge. It stood empty and silent, bathed in moonlight. "See?" Sarah said, her voice a mix of relief and disappointment. "No ghost, just an old brr." Her words cut off abruptly as a figure stepped out from behind a tree on the far side of the bridge. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall and lean, dressed in dark clothes. But as it moved into the moonlight, we could see that something was terribly wrong. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Its head lolled at an impossible angle, swaying with each step, and its face, in the harsh beam of our flashlights, we could see that where features should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. For a long moment, we all stood frozen. Sarah and I rooted to the spot in terror, the figure swaying gently in the middle of the bridge. Then it turned its blank face towards us and let out that bone-chilling scream. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand and yanking her back the way we'd come. We crashed through the underbrush, all attempts at stealth forgotten. I could hear it behind us, its uneven footsteps and that awful, inhuman shrieking growing closer with each passing second. Sarah stumbled, nearly pulling me down with her. I hauled her to her feet, risking a glance back. The thing was barely 10 feet behind us, its arms outstretched, fingers elongated into cruel-looking claws. "Come on," I urged, my voice cracking with fear. "We're almost to the trailhead." But we weren't. We'd wandered far off the main trail in our panic, and now we were lost in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees seemed to press in around us, branches reaching out like grasping hands to snag our clothes and hair. Just as I thought we couldn't run any further, we burst into a small clearing. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, their surfaces covered in strange, swirling symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Without thinking, I pulled Sarah into the circle. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the air changed. The sounds of pursuit cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. We turned, expecting to see our pursuer bursting into the clearing, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent forest. What was that thing?" Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. I shook my head, unable to find words to describe the horror we'd just escaped. "I don't know, but I don't think it was human." As the adrenaline began to fade, I became aware of our surroundings. The stone circle we stood in radiated a strange energy, making the air feel thick and heavy. The symbols carved into the stones seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, shifting and rearranging themselves. "Alex," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear, "I don't think we should be in here." I nodded, suddenly sure that she was right. Whatever this place was, it wasn't meant for us. But as we turned to leave, we found our path blocked. Figures stood between each of the standing stones, surrounding us. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs and faces that were somehow both animal and human. Their eyes glowed with an inner light, fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. One of them stepped forward, its movements fluid and graceful in a way that seemed utterly alien. When it spoke, its voice was like the rustling of dry leaves. "You have entered the sacred circle," it said. "The price must be paid." Sarah's hand found mine again, squeezing so tight it hurt. "What price?" she whispered. The creature's mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile on a human face. On its features, it was terrifying. "One of you must stay," it said, "to join our hunt." Understanding dawned, cold and horrifying. The thing that had chased us. The Midnight Wanderer. It had once been human, hadn't it? Someone who had stumbled into this circle. Just like us. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're leaving. Both of us." The creature's eyes narrowed. "You cannot leave. The circle has chosen. One stays, or neither leaves." I looked at Sarah, saw the terror in her eyes, and made a decision. "Take me," I said. "Let her go." "Alex." "No," Sarah cried, but I squeezed her hand, silencing her. The creature tilted its head, considering. Then it nodded. "The choice is made," it said. "She may go." Before I could react, two of the figures grabbed Sarah, dragging her towards the edge of the circle. She fought and screamed, reaching for me, but their grip was implacable. "I'll come back for you," she yelled as they pushed her beyond the stones. "I promise, Alex. I'll find a way." And then she was gone, swallowed up by the dark forest. I turned back to the creature, fear warring with anger in my chest. "What happens now?" I asked. Its knot smile widened. "Now," it said, "you become one of us." As it reached for me with long, inhuman fingers, I closed my eyes. I thought of Sarah, hoped she'd make it out safely, and I prayed that she'd forget her promise, because the forest was no place for humans after dark. Not anymore. The last thing I remember is a searing pain, like my very essence was being rewritten. And then, nothing. I don't know how long it's been. Time has no meaning here in the circle. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and unwary hikers venture onto the Black Ridge Trail, I feel a stirring, a hunger, and I step out of the circle, my new form jerky and unnatural, to begin the hunt. So if you're ever hiking in these woods at night and you see a tall, unnaturally still figure on the trail ahead, run, run, and don't look back, because I can't stop myself anymore, and the circle always demands its price. The howl that echoed through the forest wasn't a wolf's cry. It was something far more sinister. As the eerie sound morphed into a chilling imitation of human laughter, I realized with growing horror that we weren't alone in these woods, and whatever was out there was toying with us. My name's Jack, and I've been an avid hiker for most of my life. I thought I'd seen it all: treacherous mountain paths, unexpected wildlife encounters, even the occasional dangerous weather situation. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during that ill-fated camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my two best friends, Sarah and Mike. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. As we set off down the trail that Friday afternoon, our backpacks loaded with supplies and our spirits high, I never could have imagined the nightmare that awaited us. The first day of our hike was picture perfect. The weather was mild, the autumn foliage was stunning, and we made good time on the trail. We set up camp in a small clearing as the sun began to set, gathering around a crackling campfire to roast marshmallows and share stories. It wasn't until well after midnight that things started to feel off. I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had disturbed my sleep. The forest, which had been alive with the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and owls, was now eerily silent. As I lay there in my tent, straining my ears, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like someone whistling a tune. I unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the darkness. The dying embers of our campfire cast a faint, flickering light across the clearing, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Just as I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, the whistling came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the tree line. "Guys," I whispered, reaching over to shake Sarah and Mike awake. "Do you hear that?" They stirred groggily, but as soon as they were fully awake, their expressions mirrored my own unease. The whistling had stopped, replaced by what sounded like soft laughter. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could respond, a new sound cut through the night, a long, mournful howl that started low and rose to a hair-raising pitch. It was almost, but not quite, like a wolf's cry. There was something off about it, something that sent chills down my spine. "That's no wolf," Mike said, his voice shaking slightly. "It sounds almost human." As if in response to his words, the howl morphed into laughter again, a high, cackling sound that was a grotesque parody of human mirth. It seemed to come from all around us, as if we were surrounded. We huddled together in the tent, too terrified to go outside, but too alert to even think about sleeping. As the night wore on, the sounds continued, an unsettling mix of animal noises and human-like vocalizations. Sometimes it sounded like whispers just outside our tent. Other times, it was like someone, or something, was mimicking our own voices, calling out to each other using our names. When dawn finally broke, we wasted no time in breaking camp. The forest was quiet now, the morning birdsong almost jarringly normal after the terrors of the night. But as we hurriedly packed up our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We set off down the trail at a brisk pace, eager to put as much distance between us and our campsite as possible. But it soon became clear that our ordeal was far from over. As we hiked, the strange noises followed us. They always seemed to come from just out of sight. A rustle in the underbrush, a snapping twig, that same eerie laughter echoing through the trees. Occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of movement in our peripheral vision, but whenever we turned to look, there was nothing there. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. "What's out there?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. Nothing in my years of outdoor experience had prepared me for this. Whatever was stalking us through these woods defied logical explanation. As the day wore on, the encounters grew bolder. At one point, as we paused to consult our map, a rock came sailing out of the forest, landing with a thud just feet from where we stood. When we whirled to face the direction it had come from, we saw nothing but trees and shadows. The sun was starting to set when we reached a fork in the trail. According to our map, the left path led to a ranger station about 5 miles away. The right fork continued deeper into the wilderness. "We should take the left path," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If we push hard, we can make it to the ranger station before full dark." But as we started down the left-hand trail, an overwhelming sense of wrongness washed over me. The air seemed to thicken, and the shadows between the trees grew deeper, more menacing. That's when we heard it, a perfect imitation of my own voice, coming from the right-hand path. "This way, guys," it called. "The ranger station is this way." Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Jack," she whispered, "that wasn't you, was it?" I shook my head, unable to speak. The thing using my voice called out again, this time mimicking Sarah's high-pitched tones. "Hurry up, we're almost there." Mike took a hesitant step towards the right-hand path. "Maybe we read the map wrong," he said uncertainly. "It sounds like we should go this way." "No," I shouted, snapping out of my shock. "That's not us. Whatever's out there, it's trying to lure us off the trail." As if angered by my outburst, a chorus of howls erupted from the forest around us. They were closer now, much closer, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. "Run," I yelled, grabbing Sarah and Mike's hands and pulling them down the left-hand path. We ran as we'd never run before, blind panic giving us speed we didn't know we possessed. The sounds of pursuit were all around us, crashing through the trees, that terrible laughter, and always the sound of our own voices calling out to us, pleading with us to stop, to turn back, to join them. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we burst out of the tree line and into a large clearing. The ranger station stood before us, its windows glowing with warm electric light. We sprinted across the open ground, not daring to look back. As we reached the steps of the station, I risked a glance over my shoulder. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Figures stood at the edge of the forest, tall, spindly shapes that were almost, but not quite, human. Their bodies seemed to shift and waver, as if they weren't fully solid. But it was their faces that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Blank, featureless expanses broken only by wide, grinning mouths filled with needle-sharp teeth. We crashed through the door of the ranger station, babbling our story to the startled park rangers inside. They were skeptical at first, but something in our wild-eyed terror must have convinced them. They radioed for backup and kept us safely inside until morning. In the light of day, a search of the area revealed nothing unusual. No strange tracks, no evidence of the creatures we'd seen. The rangers chalked it up to an elaborate prank by locals, or maybe a case of mutual hysteria brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of the deep woods. But I know what we experienced was real. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can still hear that eerie laughter, those mocking imitations of human voices. And I know that somewhere out there in the darkest parts of the forest, something is waiting, watching, hungry for unwary travelers to stumble into its domain. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but I never go into the deep woods alone anymore. And if I ever hear something calling my name from the shadows between the trees, I know better than to answer, because some things that dwell in the wilderness are best left undisturbed, and some voices are best left unanswered. The windows were eyes, staring at me through the darkness. I stood frozen on the porch, key in hand, as the realization hit me. The cabin I'd been house-sitting for the past week was no longer empty. Something was inside, waiting for me. I never should have taken this job, but when my cousin Mark asked if I could watch his place while he and his wife went on a second honeymoon, I jumped at the chance. A week alone in a beautiful cabin in the woods, away from the stress of my city job and my failing relationship. It sounded like paradise. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I hiked the nearby trails, read books by the fireplace, and enjoyed the peaceful solitude. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light during the day and offered stunning views of the surrounding forest. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to feel off. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, sure I'd heard something moving around downstairs. But when I gathered the courage to investigate, I found nothing out of place. I chalked it up to unfamiliar house noises and went back to bed. The next day, I noticed small things that didn't seem quite right. A book I was sure I'd left on the coffee table was back on the shelf. The throw blanket on the couch was folded differently than I remembered leaving it. Little things, easy to dismiss, but they added up to a creeping sense of unease. That night, I definitely heard footsteps. Soft, careful steps moving from room to room downstairs. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening as they moved closer to the stairs. Just as I thought they were about to start climbing, they retreated. By the time dawn broke and I finally worked up the nerve to go downstairs, there was no sign anyone had been there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal that had found its way in somehow. Or maybe the stress and solitude were getting to me, making me imagine things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I called Mark, trying to keep the panic out of my voice as I casually asked if anyone else had a key to the place. He assured me that only he and his wife had keys, and they were both with them on their trip. When he asked if everything was okay, I lied and said everything was fine. I didn't want to ruin their vacation over what was probably nothing, but it wasn't nothing. That night, the footsteps came again, louder this time, and they were accompanied by something else. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a table. It moved from room to room, always staying just out of sight, just around the corner. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed a bag and left, telling myself I'd just go into town for the day to clear my head. But as I drove down the winding mountain road, a weight lifted off my chest. I spent the day in a small cafe, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. As evening approached, I knew I had to go back. I couldn't just abandon my responsibility to Mark. Plus, all my things were still there. So, steeling my nerves, I drove back up to the cabin as the sun was setting, which brings me to now, standing on the porch, key in hand, staring at the windows that seemed to stare back. The lights were off. I was sure I'd left at least the porch light on, but I could swear I saw movement inside. A shadow passing by the living room window, too tall and thin to be human. My hand shook as I inserted the key into the lock. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was nothing in there. I'd go in, turn on all the lights, and laugh at how scared I'd been over nothing. The door swung open with a creak that seemed obscenely loud in the quiet night. The interior of the cabin was pitch black. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers scrabbling against the wall. Click. Nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, pulling out my phone to use as a flashlight. The beam of light swept across the living room, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. The furniture was all in place, no sign of an intruder. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through me. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping sound, coming from upstairs. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. My relief evaporated instantly, replaced by icy terror. I stood frozen, listening as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was moving, I realized, coming down the stairs. I should have run, should have bolted out the door and driven away as fast as I could. But fear rooted me to the spot. I could only watch, my phone's light trained on the base of the stairs, as the tapping got closer and closer. A foot appeared on the bottom step, long and pale with toes that looked more like claws. Then another. Slowly, deliberately, the thing descended the stairs. In the harsh light of my phone, I saw it clearly. It was humanoid, but stretched and distorted, like a person's reflection in a funhouse mirror. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles. Its skin was a sickly gray color, pulled tight over an emaciated frame. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank expanse of gray. As it reached the bottom of the stairs, its head swiveled towards me. Though it had no eyes, I felt seen, examined, dissected by its gaze. It cocked its head to one side, an almost curious gesture that made it seem even more alien. Then, impossibly, a seam appeared in the smooth skin of its face. It split open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. From the depths of that horrifying maw came a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a scream, but something in between. I ran. Dropping my phone, I bolted for the door. I could hear it behind me, its unnatural limbs allowing it to cover ground faster than should be possible. Just as I reached the porch, I felt something brush against my back. Long, cold fingers, just missing their grip. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I looked back at the cabin. The thing stood in the doorway, its eyeless face turned towards me. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one long-fingered hand and waved. I peeled out of there so fast I'm surprised I didn't leave tire marks. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I was 2 states away. I called Mark the next day, babbling some excuse about a family emergency. He was understanding, said he'd get someone else to check on the place. I never told him what really happened. Who would believe me? Sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself. But on quiet nights, when the wind whistles just right, I swear I can hear that tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. And I know with bone-deep certainty that somewhere out there, in that cabin in the woods, something is waiting, watching, and one day, it might decide to come looking for me. So if you're ever asked to house-sit a remote cabin, think twice, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the dark. And some things, once seen, can never be unseen. The camera shutter clicked, capturing the serene forest scene before me. It wasn't until I reviewed the image on my screen that I saw it. A pale, elongated figure lurking in the shadows, its hollow eyes fixed directly on me. My blood ran cold as I realized I'd been unknowingly photographing my own stalker. I've always been passionate about nature photography. There's something magical about capturing the raw beauty of the wilderness, freezing moments of perfect tranquility or explosive action. But that day in the Adirondack Mountains changed everything for me. My name's Alex, and I'd ventured deep into the backcountry for a week-long solo photography expedition. I was chasing the perfect shot, hoping to catch the elusive interplay of mist, morning light, and autumn foliage that the region is famous for. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I woke before dawn each morning, hiking to vantage points I'd scouted the day before. As the sun rose, painting the landscape in ethereal hues, I lost myself in the rhythm of composing shots and adjusting settings. It was on the fourth day that things started to feel off. I'd hiked further than usual, pushing into a part of the forest that felt older, darker somehow. The trees here were gnarled and massive, their branches twisting together overhead to create a canopy that barely let any light through. As I set up my tripod in a small clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a curious deer or maybe a black bear. But there was never anything there, just more trees and shadows. I tried to focus on my work, capturing the play of light filtering through the leaves. But with each shot, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, I decided to call it quits. I'd gotten some good shots, but the creeping sense of wrongness had ruined my concentration. I packed up my gear and started the long hike back to my campsite. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling in the underbrush, too deliberate to be the wind. I froze, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, I heard it again, closer this time. My heart pounding, I quickened my pace. The rustling followed, always just out of sight. I found myself glancing back every few steps, but the deepening shadows revealed nothing. I practically ran the last half mile to my campsite, my camera gear bouncing painfully against my back. As I burst into the small clearing where I'd pitched my tent, the feeling of being watched intensified. I spun in a circle, my eyes darting from tree to tree, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. With shaking hands, I zipped myself into my tent, grateful for the flimsy barrier between me and whatever was out there. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that my imagination had run wild in the isolation of the deep woods. But as I lay there in the growing darkness, every snapping twig and rustling leaf sounded like footsteps approaching my tent. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with unsettling dreams. I woke before dawn, groggy and on edge. Part of me wanted to pack up and hike out right then, to leave this suddenly menacing forest behind. But the photographer in me couldn't resist one last attempt at capturing the perfect morning shot. I hiked to a ridge I'd scouted earlier in the week, arriving just as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the morning mist. Despite my lingering unease, I found myself falling into the familiar routine of setting up my equipment. As the sun rose, bathing the valley below in golden light, I lost myself in the viewfinder. I snapped shot after shot, adjusting settings and angles to capture the ever-changing tableau before me. It wasn't until I paused to review some of the images that I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow or lens flare creating an odd shape in the background. But as I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. There, lurking in the shadows between two massive oak trees, was a figure. It was unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs elongated and jointed in ways that seemed impossible. Its skin was a sickly pale color, almost translucent in the early morning light, but it was the face that truly terrified me. Featureless save for two deep, black hollows where eyes should have been. And it was staring directly at the camera, directly at me. I dropped my camera, the expensive equipment clattering against the rocky ground. My eyes darted to the spot where I'd seen the creature, but there was nothing there. Just trees and mist and early morning shadows. With trembling hands, I picked up my camera and flipped through the images I'd taken. The figure was in every shot, always half hidden, always watching. In each successive photo, it was closer, as if it had been slowly creeping up on me while I was distracted by my work. Panic overtook me. I abandoned my tripod and half of my gear, shoving my camera into my backpack and running blindly down the trail. Branches whipped at my face, Roots threatened to trip me, but terror drove me on. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green tunnel of the forest, but eventually, my lungs burning and legs shaking, I burst out onto a dirt road. A battered pickup truck was approaching, and I waved my arms frantically. The truck screeched to a halt, an old man peering out at me with concern. "You all right, son?" he called. "Looks like you've seen a ghost." I turned to look back at the forest, half expecting to see that pale, elongated figure emerging from the trees. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent woods. I think I'm lost," I managed to stammer. "Can you give me a ride to town?" The old man nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. As we drove away, I couldn't stop looking back, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us go. It wasn't until we reached the nearest town that I realized how far I'd run. I was miles from where I'd left my car, in a completely different part of the forest. The old man dropped me off at a small diner, refusing any payment and giving me a long, searching look before he drove away. As I sat in a booth, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee to stop their shaking, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination brought on by isolation and an overactive imagination. But when I finally worked up the courage to look at my camera again, the photos were still there. That impossible figure, drawing closer with each shot. I never went back for the rest of my gear. Some things aren't worth the risk. I never shared those photos either. Never told anyone the full story of what I saw in those woods. Some truths are too dangerous, too reality-altering to spread. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that day. Sometimes, when I'm editing photos late at night, I catch glimpses of impossible shapes lurking in the backgrounds of my shots. Shadows that don't quite match their surroundings. Figures half hidden behind trees that I know weren't there when I took the picture. I don't do nature photography anymore. I stick to well-populated areas, to subjects that don't involve venturing into the deep wilderness. Because now I know the truth. Sometimes, when we point our cameras into the unknown, something looks back, and not everything that watches us from the shadows is content to remain unseen. So if you're ever hiking in the deep woods and you feel that prickling sensation of being watched, trust your instincts. Don't discount that movement you catch out of the corner of your eye. And maybe think twice before you try to capture the perfect shot of that pristine wilderness. Because you never know what you might capture instead, or what might be capturing you. The chanting grew louder, echoing through the trees as I frantically tried to stuff my sleeping bag into my backpack. My hands shook uncontrollably, fumbling with zippers and straps. I knew I had to get out of there fast, but the strange symbols carved into the trees around my campsite seemed to be watching me, pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly glow. I never should have come to these woods alone. But when you're a freelance writer desperate for your next big story, you sometimes make questionable decisions. That's how I, Jake Harrison, found myself camping in the heart of the Ozark Mountains, chasing rumors of an ancient Native American ritual site. It had started innocently enough. I'd heard whispers in the nearby town of strange lights in the forest, of hikers going missing only to return days later with no memory of where they'd been. The locals called it the Spirit Woods, and warned outsiders to stay away. But to me, it sounded like the perfect material for a gripping article that could revive my floundering career. Armed with a backpack, a tent, and more optimism than common sense, I set out into the wilderness. The first 2 days were uneventful, filled with endless hiking and fruitless searching. I was beginning to think the whole trip was a waste of time, when, on the third evening, I stumbled upon something extraordinary. It was a small clearing, perfectly circular, surrounded by ancient oak trees. What caught my eye were the symbols carved into the bark of each tree, intricate spirals and angular shapes that didn't resemble any Native American imagery I'd ever seen. At the center of the clearing stood a flat stone altar, its surface stained dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. Excitement overrode my initial unease. I set up camp at the edge of the clearing, eager to examine the site more closely in the morning light. As night fell, an oppressive silence settled over the woods. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I unzipped my tent and peered out, my blood running cold at what I saw. The symbols on the trees were glowing with a pale, bluish light. And there, moving between the trees, were figures. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs that moved with an inhuman grace. Their faces, when I caught glimpses of them, were an unsettling blend of human and animal features. I watched, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and fascination, as these beings performed what could only be described as a ritual. They danced and chanted, their voices rising and falling in a language I'd never heard before. The glowing symbols on the trees seemed to pulse in time with their movements. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped and turned, looking directly at me. Its eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the tree symbols, and I felt a presence push against my mind, alien and ancient. "Watcher," a voice echoed in my head. "You do not belong here." That's when I started packing, desperate to get as far away from this place as possible. But in my panic, everything seemed to go wrong. My fingers felt clumsy and uncooperative, and no matter how I tried, I couldn't seem to get my gear packed quickly enough. The chanting grew louder, and I could feel the beings moving closer to my tent. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Just as I finally managed to get my backpack closed, a long-fingered hand thrust through the tent fabric, reaching for me. I screamed and bolted, leaving half my gear behind. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear them behind me, their inhuman voices calling out in that strange, ancient language. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I burst out of the tree line and onto a dirt road. A pair of headlights approached, and I waved my arms frantically, praying it wasn't just another hallucination. The truck screeched to a halt, and an old man leaned out the window, his face a mixture of concern and wariness. "You all right, son?" he called out. I turned to look back at the forest, expecting to see my pursuers emerging from the trees, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent woods. I think so," I stammered, my voice shaky. "Can you give me a ride to town?" The old man nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us from the tree line, but there was nothing. It wasn't until we reached the town that I realized how far I'd run. I was miles from where I'd set up camp, in a completely different part of the forest. The old man dropped me off at a small motel, refusing any payment and giving me a long, searching look before he drove away. That night, as I lay in the lumpy motel bed, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to go back, to document everything and break the story of a lifetime. But a larger part, the part that still echoed with that alien presence I'd encountered, knew that some stories were better left untold. In the days that followed, I heard whispers around town. Other campers had gone missing in those woods, only to return days later with no memory of where they'd been. Some came back changed, their eyes holding a haunted look that never quite faded. I left town as soon as I could, abandoning my half-finished article and any dreams of reviving my writing career. Some truths, I realized, were not meant to be shared. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that night. Sometimes, in my dreams, I hear that chanting again. I see those glowing symbols and feel that alien presence pushing against my mind, and I wake up in a cold sweat, grateful for the mundane safety of my small apartment, far from any dark and ancient forests. I never went camping again after that night. Never ventured into any woods alone. Because now I know the truth. There are things out there, hidden in the wild places of the world, that defy our understanding. Things that were old when humanity was young, and that will still be there long after we're gone. So if you're ever hiking in remote woods and you come across a clearing with strange symbols carved into the trees, turn back. No story, no discovery, is worth the price of crossing paths with what dwells in those shadowed places. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some truths better left unknown. As for me, I'll stick to the safety of the city, where the only things that go bump in the night are my neighbors and the occasional stray cat. Because I've seen what lurks in the deep woods, and once you've glimpsed that other world, you can never truly forget it or feel completely safe in the dark again. The low growl sent shivers down my spine as I realized the truth. This wasn't just a wild animal blocking our path. It was hurting us, deliberately pushing us deeper into the mountains. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was waiting for us in the darkness ahead. My name's Sarah, and I've been an avid backpacker for years. This particular trip was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my best friend, Lisa, and her boyfriend, Mike. We'd chosen a challenging trail in the Cascade Mountains, known for its stunning views and diverse wildlife. What we didn't know was that we were walking into a nightmare. The first day of our hike was perfect. Clear skies, cool breezes, and the kind of scenery that makes you forget all about the modern world. We made good time, setting up camp in a picturesque meadow as the sun began to set. Around the campfire that night, we laughed and shared stories, blissfully unaware of what the next day would bring. We broke camp early the next morning, eager to reach the summit before afternoon thunderstorms rolled in. About 2 hours into our hike, we rounded a bend in the trail and came face to face with a massive grizzly bear. Time seemed to stop as we stood there, frozen in shock. The bear was huge, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. Its eyes, small and dark, held an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. "Nobody move," Mike whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Back away slowly." We began to inch backwards, our hearts pounding, but instead of charging or running away, the bear did something unexpected. It dropped to all fours and began to pace back and forth across the trail, effectively blocking our path forward. "Let's turn back," Lisa suggested. "We can try a different route." It seemed like a sensible plan, so we carefully retreated the way we'd come, but as we hiked back down the trail, we realized the bear was following us. It kept its distance, always just visible through the trees, but unmistakably there. "This isn't normal behavior," I said, worry creeping into my voice. "Bears don't usually stalk people like this." Mike nodded grimly. "Maybe it's sick or injured. We need to find another way around." We veered off the main trail, hoping to loop around and rejoin it further up the mountain. But no matter which direction we took, the bear was always there, growling softly, herding us away from our intended path. As the day wore on, a sense of dread began to settle over us. We were being driven deeper into unfamiliar territory, far from the well-marked trails and our planned route. The forest around us grew denser, darker, the trees pressing in close on either side. "We need to call for help," Lisa said, pulling out her satellite phone. But her face fell as she stared at the screen. "No signal. How is that possible?" A cold knot formed in my stomach. We were using top-of-the-line equipment, specifically chosen for its reliability in remote areas. For it to fail now. The bear's growl grew louder, more insistent. We picked up our pace, no longer even pretending to choose our own path. We were being driven, like cattle, toward some unknown destination. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood a circle of standing stones, each easily 10 feet tall and covered in strange, swirling symbols. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, staring at the impossible structure. Before any of us could respond, a chorus of howls erupted from the forest around us. The bear, which had been our constant shadow all day, melted back into the trees without a sound. "Wolves," Lisa whispered, her face pale with fear. But as the howls grew closer, I realized they didn't sound quite right. There was something off about the pitch, something almost human. "Get to the stones," I said, a sudden certainty gripping me. "Now." We sprinted across the clearing, reaching the stone circle just as the first of our pursuers burst from the tree line. I nearly screamed at the sight of them. They were wolf-like in shape, but much larger than any natural wolf. Their fur was patchy and matted, hanging off frames that seemed too thin, too angular to be real. But it was their eyes that truly terrified me, glowing with an unnatural intelligence, filled with a hunger that went beyond mere physical need. As the pack circled the stones, I noticed something strange. They never crossed the invisible line created by the circle. It was as if some unseen barrier held them at bay. "What are they?" Lisa whimpered, clinging to Mike's arm. "I don't think they're wolves," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "At least, not anymore." As if in response to my words, the largest of the creatures stepped forward. Before our eyes, its form began to shift and change. Fur receded, limbs elongated, until a man stood before us, naked, wild-looking, with those same glowing eyes. "Welcome," he said, his voice a guttural growl. "We've been waiting for you." "What do you want?" Mike demanded, trying to sound brave despite the terror I could see in his eyes. The man-thing smiled, revealing teeth that were still too sharp, too animal to be human. "We want you to join us, of course. To run with the pack, to feel the thrill of the hunt." "You're insane," Lisa spat. "We're not going anywhere with you." The creature's smile widened. "Oh, but you will. You see, you're already changing. The moment you stepped into these woods, you became part of our world, and there's no going back now." As he spoke, I became aware of a strange sensation coursing through my body. My senses felt sharper, more acute. I could smell the fear rolling off my friends, hear the rapid beating of their hearts, and deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I felt a stirring of something wild and hungry. "No," I said, shaking my head to clear it. "This isn't real, it can't be." The man-thing laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, it's very real, and soon you'll embrace it. You'll run with us under the full moon, hunt with us, become one with the forest." I looked at Lisa and Mike, saw the same conflict I felt mirrored in their eyes. Part of me, a growing part, wanted to step out of the circle, to join these creatures in their wild, primal existence, but another part, the part that still clung to my humanity, knew we had to resist. "We're not leaving this circle," I said, surprised by the strength in my voice, "and we're not joining your pack." The man-thing's eyes narrowed. "You don't have a choice. The change has already begun. You can feel it, can't you? The pull of the wild, the hunger for the hunt." He was right. With each passing moment, the urge to give in grew stronger. I could feel my body wanting to change, to shift into something new and terrifying. But as I stood there, teetering on the edge of transformation, I remembered something my grandmother once told me. "In the darkest moments," she'd said, "when it seems like all hope is lost, that's when you must hold on tightest to who you are." I grasped Lisa and Mike's hands, squeezing tight. "We are not animals," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "We are human beings, and we choose to remain human." A pulse of energy seemed to emanate from the standing stones, pushing back against the encroaching wildness. The man-thing snarled, taking a step back. "You can't resist forever," he growled. "Sooner or later you'll join us. It's your nature now." But I knew he was wrong. As the night wore on, we huddled together in the center of the stone circle, holding on to our humanity with every ounce of strength we possessed. And when dawn finally broke, The creatures melted away into the forest, leaving us alone and shaken, but still ourselves. We never spoke about what happened that night, not even to each other. How could we explain it to anyone else? But to this day, when the moon is full and I hear a wolf's howl in the distance, I feel that pull again, the call of the wild, the temptation to let go and run free. But I resist, because I know the truth now. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces that can change us in ways we can't imagine. And sometimes, the greatest challenge isn't surviving the wilderness, but holding on to our humanity in the face of the unknown. So if you're ever hiking in remote mountains and you encounter a bear that seems too intelligent, too purposeful in its actions, turn back. Because some trails lead to places we're not meant to go, and some transformations once begun can never truly be undone.